It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for this invitation. I have to apologize that I think I've got about an hour's worth of content, but apparently I only have half an hour to speak. So I'm going to do my best to condense the many things that I want to say to you today and hopefully still get the message across. So let me start by setting a little bit of the scene for this talk today. And you'll see from the title of my address that my comments are focused on in the wild technology testing. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, this might seem a little unusual, but there are various ways in which trialing new technologies actually fits with my ongoing research. And there are two particularly important ongoing debates that I want to bring into this discussion in order to frame the comments that I'm going to make today. And the first is, as you know, there are a number of concrete reform proposals concerning the regulation of digital technologies, particularly the EU's proposed AI Act, and that has been the subject of continuing discussion and debate. And secondly, there's considerable controversy about the use of live biometric surveillance technologies, particularly by law enforcement in public settings. So these two particular debates I want to tap into by thinking about the use of technology testing in the wild. And at least as far as proposals for regulation are concerned, I have to confess I'm really pleased to see that the discussion has moved on from talking about voluntary ethics principles to the need for legally binding institutional frameworks and mechanisms. But I'm still troubled by the lack of attention that's being paid to operationalizing many of the noble statements of principle, like the importance of democracy and human rights and safety, for example, and translating those principles into real world settings. And it's this translation piece where it strikes me that digital technology testing offers a really valuable focal point for examining how these aspirational principles and values are translated into practical settings. At the same time, many of you will know that the use of live facial recognition technologies, FRT, by law enforcement authorities in public settings has become a live hot button issue in many self-described liberal democratic states. And as this debate continues to rage, law enforcement agencies in Europe have just been getting on with it, pushing ahead and trialing these technologies in public settings. So that sets the stage for my lecture today. And I'm going to begin by offering you a very brief set of snapshots describing 4 recent live FRT trials undertaken by law enforcement authorities in Europe, specifically in London, Wales, Berlin, and Nice, based on publicly available information, which I've been investigating together with my colleague Leigh, who has been working with me on a larger project concerned with digital experimentation. So once I've briefly described these trials, I'm going to try and use these trials as a vehicle for reflection about 3 larger questions. Questions about the trustworthiness of live FRT for the purposes of policing, questions about the trustworthiness of the trials themselves, and thirdly, what these live FRT trials by the police reveals about our existing regulatory frameworks for ensuring trustworthy AI in Europe. So, having set the stage, I want to then begin by looking a little bit more closely at some of these trials. But before I do that, I guess I've assumed that you all know what FRT is and how it works, but I guess I should set out just a little bit of the background before we dive right into it. So in each of the trials I'm going to mention, the police forces in question were seeking to use live FRT for the purposes of identification. And this technology relies on digital image recognition software to capture and analyze the biometric features of human faces. It creates a mathematical template or fingerprint, if you like, of each facial image from live camera feeds, and then seeks to match the template against a stored database of facial images or a watch list. So FRT uses software algorithms that have been trained on large volumes of facial images in order to learn to identify distinctive facial features, and then it estimates the probability that the image of a person captured via the live stream video surveillance actually matches that of the person whose image is stored in the watch list. So this matching process is probabilistic in that it evaluates the statistical similarity between two facial image templates and then identifies a match depending upon a pre-programmed statistical error threshold. So why is this technology particularly attractive to police and law enforcement agencies? So although FIT software has been used for some time to analyze images, particularly videos collected from CCTV cameras for investigative and forensic purposes ex post after the event, the attraction of live FRT rests in its potential to utilize its image matching capacities in real time to discover wanted individuals in order to apprehend them. So as the following trials demonstrate, however, it's one thing for the software to do what it says on the tin and quite another for the police to utilize it successfully to find terrorists and missing children. So with that background, I want to provide a little account of 4 different trials that have taken place in recent years, beginning with the trials in London. So between 2016 and 2019, the London Metropolitan Police Service partnered with private software firm NEC to trial its NeoFace software, and it conducted 10 operational trials across London in different settings. These varied from highly crowded open settings like the Notting Hill Carnival and Soho in central London, open but well-controlled environments where there's a narrow flow of people facing the camera, such as the Remembrance Sunday parade, and ferry passengers getting on and off the ferry at the Port of Hull, as well as testing it in busy town centres such as Stratford and Romford. Now, importantly, all of these trials were operational insofar as they were tested by police to identify whether they could actually catch people that they wanted. Rather than using volunteer participants, they created watch lists of various wanted people to see if they could find them in the crowd where the cameras were located. So to do this, of course, that meant they weren't going to be able to get informed consent from everybody who passed by the cameras. Instead, they rested their legal authority on the common law powers to prevent crime and to keep the peace. But of course, because we know that the matching isn't perfect, it meant that when an alert was generated, a decision had to be made about whether or not that was a reasonably accurate alert in order to warrant sending a field officer to apprehend that person and find out if it was actually the person that they were after. And they used various kinds of techniques to engage in this adjudicative process. So in the early trials, you would have a control van and a person was receiving the alerts, and then they'd radio one of the field officers to say, oh, we've found somebody and this is described how they looked, in order for that field officer to go and apprehend the individual. But in later trials, field officers had their own handheld devices and they received automated match alerts. And sometimes they acted independently of the instructions from the control van officers based on their own judgment of whether or not the match was suitable for seeking to apprehend the individual. So in terms of the results across the 10 trials, I do actually have data about how many faces were scanned. I think it's about 200,000 over 10 trials. This resulted in 25 engagements with individuals, resulting in a total of 9 arrests. So it's a lot of faces for 9 arrests, but only 2 of these arrests occurred during the earlier trials, and it wasn't until the watch list was enlarged 5-fold that the number of arrests expanded considerably. So then we turn to the Welsh trials. This is by far the most extensive set of operational trials that we have looked at. And between the 3 years up until 2020, again, the South Wales Police, partnering with private software firm NEC with the same software, conducted 69 operational trials in a similar manner to that in London, same kinds of legal authorities, same variation in settings in which they trialed the technology, including at major football matches, a boat race, music concerts, royal visits, and controversially, a peaceful anti-arms protest. And these trials were subject to a legal challenge by campaigner Ed Bridges, supported by Big Brother Watch. It did result in a finding by the Court of Appeal that the trials were unlawful for several reasons, but the court refused to pronounce on the general legality of future FIT trials by the police, and they have subsequently taken place. Turning then to Berlin, very different kind of trials. This occurred for a year between August 2017 and July 2018. And the German federal police here undertook these trials in partnership with Deutsche Bahn, the German national rail operator, with the backing of the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry for Education, trialing 3 different software products by 3 different providers, 2 of them German, 1 of them American. All of the trials, however, took place at Berlin-Zuckritz train station using existing CCTV surveillance cameras that were already installed. But unlike the Welsh and London trials, this trial only included volunteers. So they recruited hundreds of volunteers to participate either for 6 months or a year. Their biometric data was collected to build the watch list, and everyone who participated got a €25 gift card. Those who got through the most often got Apple Watches as incentives. In terms of legal authority, however, the basis upon which these trials were conducted was that of voluntary informed consent. And you'll see from this picture that passengers who didn't want to have their faces subject to scanning and matching could pass through the white stickered area rather than the blue stickered area in order to avoid the cameras. Finally, then, that takes me to the Nice trial, very different again. And although the French have undertaken many initiatives to test FRT in various contexts, including schools, airports, and train stations, the Nice trial is the only one that has taken place in an unconstrained live environment. It was selected as the trial site because of the terrorist attack in 2016, so that Nice now has the largest number of public CCTV cameras in France. Again, they used a private software, this time by a Monaco-based firm. And like Berlin, they used volunteers, but it was a very short trial, only for 3 days, specifically at the Nice Carnival with 6 cameras installed, and the crowd flow was constrained. Again, it relied on informed consent by volunteers and no coercive powers of the state. And the volunteer sample was very small. Only 8 volunteers submitted their photos. But despite the small number of volunteers and the brevity of the trial, the Nice police hailed it as a success, and they plan to test the technology in other locations over longer time periods. So that was a quick rush through 4 fascinating trials, and there are many features that I could address, but I think that's probably enough to get started. A couple of features of these trials are really quite striking. Firstly, extraordinary variation in the way in which these trials were designed and conducted. Secondly, it's noticeable that the Berlin and Nice trials were limited to using volunteer participants, and they were only concerned with testing software accuracy in live settings. The London and Welsh trials, on the other hand, were described as operational, and they actually used the technology to identify and apprehend people that the police in fact wanted. And I think the third feature that's particularly striking is, in order to use this software to catch criminals, to catch people that you want, in fact, an enormous effort is required in order to plan and coordinate multiple technological, social, organization, and human resources. So there are many different ways we could analyze these trials, and indeed we have done that, and one of the papers we've written just looks at trials themselves. But what I want to do today is to examine these trials in light of ongoing debates about how we regulate and govern AI. And it seems to me that a useful starting point is to consider whether we're asking the right questions about the governance of AI. And by this, I mean the most helpful questions. And that depends, of course, on what our overarching goal is or should be. And here I want to suggest, and controversially, I hope, that what we want is that all our new products and services, whether new medicines and vaccines to data-driven technologies, is that they should be trustworthy. And so we hope that we can put in place, or that have in place, an appropriate governance framework that will enable this. But what does it mean for an algorithmic system to qualify as trustworthy, and what needs to be done to achieve this goal? Well, here we can draw on the wonderful work of British philosopher Honora O'Neill, who makes a powerful but simple point that the aim of organizations shouldn't be just to get people to trust them, but that organizations should seek to demonstrate their trustworthiness. And to do this, we need honesty, competence, and reliability. Indeed, David Spiegelhalter has drawn on her work specifically and says it seems to come down to this: Can we trust algorithms? And so he says, and I agree with him, that it's reasonable when confronted by an algorithmic system to demand and to expect trustworthy claims, both about the system, what the developers say it can do, and how it's been evaluated, and by the system, what it says about a specific case. So one of the questions we should be asking, but seem consistently to fail to ask, is whether or not AI does in fact deliver on its claimed benefits in real-world settings in which it's intended for use. And here I find myself increasingly frustrated by exaggerated claims about what AI will do. And this seems to be the norm, and as Spiegelhalter rightly observes, seem more driven by commercial rather than scientific considerations. So it's here that the role of technology testing offers a potentially valuable opportunity to bridge this gap between the rhetoric, the promises and claims about what the technology will do and what it can in fact do in the real world and what its impacts are. In other words, testing might feasibly contribute to the production of knowledge to inform policy decisions about regulation and governance. And to that extent, we can understand the evidence produced by technology testing as regulatory knowledge. So as these debates concerning how and whether to regulate AI continue and are very unsettled, it seems to me that technology testing offers a really important site through which we can gather evidence that can inform our policy decisions and to address the pervasive uncertainty that arises when a new technology emerges. But if we're to evaluate our shiny new technologies to identify what they can deliver in real world settings, that means that we cannot confine ourselves to testing performance in the lab. And this is particularly important because many of the algorithmic systems that are currently touted offer us amazing benefits that will radically transform our services and societies in amazing ways. And they are not intended to be operated in labs alone, but in complex dynamic social settings. So even when it comes to software, accuracy testing in the field is not enough. Just because a piece of software can operate effectively in terms of accuracy in a lab doesn't mean it will do so in real world settings. And the sobering experience of electronic healthcare records serves as a vivid and sobering reminder of exactly that. So I'm in agreement with David Spiegelhalter that we need to evaluate the real world impacts, at least of high risk technologies before market release, because their performance in real world settings may be very different from their lab performance. And that means then that we need to test them in properly governed field trials to see whether they can reliably be expected to produce real world benefits and under what conditions. So then if we turn our attention to the trials that I've just described, what do they tell us about whether or not live FRT for policing purposes lives up to its claims? Well, I guess that means we need to think about what claims are actually made. And yet when we come to data intensive software, the claims are usually couched in terms of performance, understood in terms of accurate matching. But as Stanford researchers have recently pointed out, wildly optimistic claims are often made about FRT accuracy, which may be very, very different from what they call true in-domain accuracy. And so I agree that we need to identify software performance that more accurately reflects real-world conditions. And in this respect, the trials undertaken in live settings in both Nice and Berlin can be understood as attempts to identify what this in-domain accuracy of the software is in real-world use, rather than simply being confined to the lab. But it's also clear that this is only the first step towards evaluation of meaningful real-world benefits, because the further claim is made, of course, that police should be using these technologies in order to catch wanted individuals with ease and efficiency. But we can see from the London and Welsh trials that were specifically oriented towards trying to catch wanted individuals using this technology, that this was no easy feat. Indeed, it shows that much more than high-performing software is required. Instead, it requires the installation, design, and successful coordination of multiple technical components in collaboration with social and human components that together form a complex socio-technical system that's capable of operating in a consistent and reliable manner, often in dynamic, crowded public settings. But achieving this in order to apprehend wanted individuals is no mean feat. And indeed, the independent evaluation of the Welsh trials concluded, and I will quote, AFR technologies can certainly assist police to identify suspects and persons of interest, both to solve past crimes and prevent future harms. However, it is not a simple or straightforward undertaking and requires considerable organizational investment and effort. So for me, the highly equivocal language in which this conclusion is expressed is very telling. And indeed, we're not provided with data on the total cost and time commitment involved in operationalising these trials, although we do know that the Welsh Police received almost £2 million in funding to undertake these trials, committing £600,000 of its own in order to fund the project. So it's not nearly as efficient as software developers would have us believe. And that brings me, of course, to the question of other impacts. Because even if we test whether the software can work in real world settings to produce their claimed benefits, that isn't enough. And yet, despite the proliferation of ethics codes and impact assessment frameworks that have been proposed, one of the things that also strikes me is that so few of them take seriously the long-standing ethical principle that informs medical practice: first, do no harm. So it goes without saying, when we're thinking of new drugs or vaccines, for example, we expect that they will be rigorously and extensively tested, not just to evaluate whether they work, that is their efficacy, but also to evaluate their adverse unintended effects. In other words, before we release new vaccines or medicines onto the market, we require that their efficacy and safety must be demonstrated by robust, reliable evidence gathering generated through clinical trials on human participants and evaluated by an independent regulator. Indeed, without this, I doubt that millions of people would now be taking the COVID vaccines that offer us an opportunity to get on top of this global pandemic that we're still suffering from. Yet what is striking when we come to the field trials of live FRT, that in none of them were attempts made to identify and monitor their adverse impacts. And why not? Why should we not expect careful and evidence-based evaluation of AI applications that might have serious consequences if things go wrong? And here it seems to me we encounter this familiar problem that I call digital exceptionalism. On this account, AI applications are not like vaccines or medicines. And indeed, I recall way back at the start of the pandemic that a colleague of mine, a machine learning expert, said to me during that time, he said, surely when you have a problem like this, it makes sense to throw the digital kitchen sink at the problem, aka let's build an app for that. And his observation demonstrates a common attitude I often encounter when thinking about the implications of data-intensive technologies, and that is there seems to be a complete lack of recognition or awareness that digital technologies have the possibility of, and indeed do, result in adverse impacts on important individual and collective values of fundamental importance, particularly when they entail automated surveillance of human activity at scale. So when it comes to live FRT, of course, the potential harms aren't primarily the dangers they pose to human health, although they might, for example, if we utilize them in critical care units to monitor for signs of distress. But when we're talking about using live FRT in public spaces, particularly by the police, then the threats lie in the dangers they pose to fundamental rights and to basic liberties of individuals, including our democratic commons. In other words, unlike new drugs or consumer goods, the adverse impacts produced are much more intangible. They're not readily measured by concrete metrics that arise from their rights' intrusive power. But just because they're intangible makes them no less real and no less serious. So one of my most important concerns about these live trials is that no attempt was made even to recognize or identify their adverse impacts. Nevertheless, if you read through the reports on the trials, there are a number of real-world flashpoints that occurred, particularly during the London and Welsh trials, where criticisms and tensions arose, and these offer various valuable clues about what the likely adverse impacts are likely to be if attempts are made by police to use them to apprehend individuals or wanted individuals in live settings, raising important questions about their legality and their ethical integrity. And these relate to the composition of the watch lists, whether or not police should and do intervene for individuals when a match alert is generated, and the importance of respecting the right of individuals to avoid the cameras if they want to in order to go about their lawful business. Well, I could say a lot more about this, but I realize that I'm using up a lot of my time, so I'm just going to say a few quick points about each of them. The first point is about the watch list. If the whole point of using live FRT is to find wanted individuals, then it seems to matter a very great deal who you place on your watch list, given the intrusiveness of these deployments. Yet rather astonishingly, there was a disturbing failure in both the London and the Welsh trials to specify clear criteria for inclusion of individuals into the watch list. And for the Welsh trials, this remains entirely unknown and undocumented, beyond the Welsh police saying that they were populated by images of persons of interest. But we know that ranged from people who were considered serious threats to public safety to people of interest who thought might be causing a disturbance, even through to vulnerable individuals whom they thought might hurt themselves. So this inability to take seriously the need to be very, very careful about watchlist composition highlights immediately the dangers of mission creep and how readily the power of live FRT in the hands of law enforcement authorities may well be abused. Because you could just imagine that once the infrastructure is in place, the temptation to expand those watch lists to anyone the police want to find, from petty criminals and others wanted for minor offences, through to those engaging in democratic protest, may be very, very difficult to resist. And this is where the mass automated surveillance capabilities of live FRT looms extremely large. Similar concerns arise in terms of the source of the images that were used on the watch list. Suffice it to say that in the Welsh trials, in some cases, the police scraped images from social media and used them to populate the watch lists. I need say no more other than this seems like a really gross failure to observe the requirements of European data protection legislation. And finally, one really important point that I want to make is about the problem of mistaken matches. And you'll see if you look at the data produced from these trials that there were a high number of inaccurate, incorrect matches. And yet they were alerted, the police were alerted to a match. And in a number of cases, they then had to go into the field to identify this individual and ask them to identify themselves to determine whether or not this was the person that they wanted. In the Welsh trials, the independent evaluators claimed that there was cooperation from the public in all cases, but we couldn't really guarantee it. And this is a problem because, at least for the time being, until Boris Johnson gets his way, the police have no legal power to stop and intervene with a person going about their lawful business. They must have reasonable suspicion in order to do so. So the mere fact that an alert is generated is not sufficient to generate reasonable suspicion. And there were some pretty hostile and disturbing incidents that occurred in the process of adjudicating whether or not a person was in fact the person that they wanted, including 5 plainclothes police officers descending on a 14-year-old boy in school uniform as he was walking down the street with his mother, who led him by the wrist to a side street, whereupon they identified that the alert was erroneous, provoking fury on the part of his mother. In another case, in the Welsh trials, a woman in her 20s was stopped on the basis of a match alert, and she was very upset when she was shown the photo because the person they wanted was in her 50s, and she claimed she looked nothing like the person who was alerted to from the software. But nonetheless, all of these instances highlight the legally fraught basis upon which police intervention takes place in relation to these alerts. And it seems to indicate that there's a real danger that what we will see is the mechanized intervention of police disturbance with people going about their lawful business without any reasonable suspicion to demonstrate that intervention is warranted. And finally, there was a case, of course, of one man, at least in the London trials, who sought to cover his face in order to avoid being filmed by the camera, and he was arrested and issued with an on-the-spot fine for disorderly behaviour. And this I find particularly disturbing, given that individuals going about their lawful business have a right to privacy, and it seems entirely contrary to the basic liberty of the individual to criminalise those who merely seek to assert their right to privacy in public settings. So that takes me then to the question of the trustworthiness of the trials themselves. So far, I've said a little bit about what the trials reveal about the real world benefits and the potential adverse impacts of FRT as a technology, but I haven't yet said very much about whether the trials themselves can be regarded as trustworthy. And here, I think there is a lot that is left to be improved. I don't, unfortunately, have more time to talk about why the trials failed to reach standards of trustworthiness, but I simply want to summarize what I think are the basic requirements for trustworthy technology testing to take place in the field. Firstly, they need to generate results that are epistemically trustworthy. There needs to be a basis upon which individuals, communities can have good reason, supported by evidence, to trust that the conduct of the trials themselves won't expose them to unfair risks or other forms of unjust exploitation, that the trials don't entail any unethical or unlawful activity, including unjustified interferences with human rights, and that the trial itself will be well governed, including all phases of the trial, from design, conduct, documentation, and evaluation, are subject to legitimate mechanisms of oversight and accountability to ensure that the trial itself is conducted in accordance with these three objectives. But unfortunately, at least in the London and Welsh trials in particular, the methodology that was adopted for the design and conduct of these trials fell well short of meeting those standards. And indeed, it was for this reason that a number of criticisms were made in the independent reports by evaluators. And in this respect, the one thing I do want to make is something that disturbed me about not only were there no success criteria specified in advance of these trials, but in relation to the official evaluations of the London trials produced by the National Physical Laboratory, and you can download this from the net, which is the UK's National Measurement Standards Laboratory, now operated by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. They did a number of things in reporting on the trial, including providing extensive numerical data in tabulated form, which is intended to display the technical performance of the system in each of the trials. Yet, even though this data appears really scientific, it only provides details of true and false positives without any mention of true and false negatives. In other words, this was not a full set of accuracy data. And no doubt that was because accuracy data simply couldn't be collected owing to the methodological design of the trials. Because they were aimed at apprehending live targets, we just don't know how many individuals were placed on the watch list but escaped identification and slipped through the net. So despite the fact that we don't have this crucial accuracy data, nor estimates of the economic, human and equipment costs associated with running these trials, this National Physical Laboratory report boldly concludes that the trials indicate that live facial recognition will help the police stop dangerous people and make London safer. Yet there's no clarity about the reasoning by which this conclusion is arrived at, nor an indication of how much help LFR will in fact provide. And so for me, this conclusion remains methodologically indefensible and unjustified on the basis of publicly available evidence. So this takes me then to my concluding comments, which concerns my third question, which is, what do these trials by police reveal about our existing regulatory frameworks for ensuring trustworthy AI in Europe? So thus far, I've emphasised the need to insist upon real-world evidence and evaluation of data-intensive technologies, at least those that pose high risks to both safety and to human rights, not just to evaluate their benefits, but also to evaluate their risks and dangers. And this seems to suggest that we need to conduct controlled field trials in order to establish the requisite evidence base, but testing in itself isn't enough. It's not a panacea for overcoming failures in the research, design, and development stage. But as David Spiegelhalter again points out in his Harvard paper, we seem persistently to fail to recognize the need for systematic structured evaluation of the kind that we apply to pharmaceuticals. And he offers a useful 4-phase structure based on the approach we take to new drugs, and it draws an analogy with a similar structure for algorithms. And here he points out that what we seem to be doing in relation to algorithmic systems is only demanding phase 1 testing. And it appears to him that our systems are not evaluated beyond simply testing them in the lab before we release them for use in public, noting that even simple medical risk scoring systems have rarely been evaluated in randomized trials. So on this basis, the willingness of European police forces to undertake field trials appears commendable. But given this serious uncertainty, this does seem to be a really useful opportunity to gain meaningful regulatory knowledge about their real-world impact. And the trials in London and Wales show that well-performing software is not enough. But the way they were conducted seems to fall very far short of the standards we need to establish the trustworthiness of the technology. Not only do we need to evaluate their benefits in real-world settings, but we also need to evaluate their adverse impacts. But perhaps even more disturbingly, that despite these very equivocal trials that were conducted in London, in January last year, the Met Police announced that they would start utilising live facial recognition on London streets on a permanent basis, completely ignoring the test results, the concerns from politicians, NGOs and others about the dangers associated with these technologies and their poor accuracy, as well as their intrusive nature. So it seems to me that that decision vividly demonstrates that our existing regulatory governance frameworks are not up to the task of ensuring trustworthy AI, and that we seem to be failing to learn the lessons of contemporary pharmaceutical regulation. And this is the reason why the COVID vaccines have been so effective, because we do have a very stringent and demanding regime for evaluating and approving pharmaceuticals before we allow them to be publicly released. But it's important to recognize that this is a relatively new regime. And even though there were some requirements for the clinical regulation of drugs by 1938, it was still possible by the early 1960s for the drug thalidomide to be marketed globally for the treatment of anxiety and morning sickness in pregnant women, which was later found to have affected approximately 10,000 embryos, with 40% of newborn babies dying at the time of birth and many thousands born with severe birth defects. Following that tragedy, new laws were swiftly introduced requiring clinical trials and independent pre-market approval before new drugs could be placed on market, requiring evidence based on adequate and well-controlled studies. In other words, it was only after thalidomide that independent legal oversight and the careful and rigorous design and conduct of clinical trials and scrutiny was taken seriously. So it seems to me that the long history of failure to attend to the unintended effects of new drugs, the need for rigorous trials and for independent evaluation is a sobering wake-up call for those of us who believe in digital exceptionalism. My fear is that live FRT may well turn out to be the thalidomide of AI, embraced across the globe without rigorous trials to demonstrate its safety or efficacy, even as it degrades the core assumptions on which liberal democratic societies rest, But unlike thalidomide, the damage wreaked by this technology may be much harder to see in the absence of thousands of dead or deformed babies. Yet it seems we're increasingly at risk of becoming human guinea pigs whenever we enter public spaces without knowing whether our faces are being remotely and automatically scanned against a watch list of suspicious individuals without our permission and without adequate safeguards to prevent them from being misused. Thank you. Very sorry for going over time. I welcome your question.